The river didn't rise that morning. It remembered. Remembered every stone it had once buried, every secret the valley had whispered into its current. When the first light struck its surface, the water moved not with anger, but with intention, swallowing fences, roads, and the boundaries people believed could hold it. By the time the sky turned silver, an old woman's scream had already become part of its song. And somewhere along the flooded edge, a brown bear lifted its head from the mist, not to hunt, but to witness what the world had forgotten. Her name was Eleanor Vale, and she had lived beside that river for 70 years. It had carried her childhood laughter, her husband's ashes, her silence. She had always trusted it, the way old people trust pain to stay familiar. That morning, she stepped outside only to move a clay pot from the porch before the wind cracked it. But when her foot touched the grass, the ground shifted under her like a lie finally confessing. The earth gave way, and suddenly the river was no longer there. It was everywhere. The shock of cold tore the breath from her chest. She gasped once, the sound lost to the roar. Her hands flailed until one caught the strap of her violin case, floating open, the instrument's varnished body knocking against her ribs like a stubborn heartbeat. She clung to it, not out of reason, but memory, because the last time she'd let go of music, her life had gone quiet for 20 years. Now, with mud in her lungs and her skirt ballooning like a sail, she held that violin as if it could remind her who she was. Upstream, through the heavy mist, something moved. At first it was just a shadow, enormous and breathing. Then came the unmistakable sound of claws against stone, deliberate, patient. A bear, dark as soaked bark, stood on a mound of half-eaten earth. Water poured off its fur in sheets. Its head tilted, eyes narrowing, not in hunger but focus. It looked at the old woman, at the case she held, and then at the current that tried to take her. The river spoke again, this time with authority. It tore loose a tree trunk and flung it downstream, a black spear spinning end over end. Eleanor ducked, the log grazing her shoulder hard enough to make the world flash white. She coughed, half a sob, half defiance. "Not yet," she rasped. "Not like this." Her words vanished, swallowed by water and wind. On the opposite bank, a ranger's truck rolled to a stop. The driver stepped out, his boots sinking into the wet clay. His name was Cal Rowan, a man who'd spent his life reading the moods of forests and rivers the way others read faces. When he saw the bear and the woman caught between them, something inside him froze, not with fear, but with the terrible understanding that the story unfolding below him was older than any rescue manual. The bear took one step closer to the edge. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the violin case, and the river, pleased with its own power, began to pull harder. Cal Rowan had seen floods before, but never one that felt intentional. The river didn't rage blindly. It seemed to choose what it wanted to keep. And right now, it wanted Eleanor Vale. He dropped to his knees at the bank's edge, calculating distance, depth, angle, the river's language. 30 meters between him and the woman. 10 more to the bear. And one wrong step between life and legend. "Hold on," he shouted, but the wind stole his voice. The woman didn't hear him. Or maybe she did, and simply had no breath left to answer. She was fighting the current with the small stubbornness of someone who had already lived through too many losses. Cal ripped the coil of rope from his pack, fingers trembling from the cold and from something else, fear disguised as urgency. He tied a loop around his waist, clipped a carabiner, and anchored it to the rusted frame of a road sign that half dangled over the drop. He looked again. The bear was still there. It stood like a carved god, shoulders glistening, breath steaming. It didn't growl. It didn't move. It simply watched, with a focus that stripped Cal of every assumption he had about what animals understood. For a strange moment, he felt as though they were sharing the same thought. She's still alive. Do something. The river slammed another branch into the current, breaking the silence like thunder. Cal stepped into the shallows, the cold cut like wire. But he didn't stop. Every muscle screamed, but he waded forward until the water clawed at his chest. The rope hummed behind him, tight and trembling. "Eleanor," he called again. This time, her eyes flicked toward him, pale and wild with disbelief. The violin case banged against her chin, but she held it as if letting go meant betrayal. "I can't," she gasped. "Yes, you can. Look at me." He extended his hand, though he was still too far. Behind her, the bear shifted its weight, front paws edging closer to the torn soil. It wasn't aggression, it was instinct, a pull older than fear. Cal froze, torn between logic and something primal whispering in his bones. The bear's gaze met his, and for an instant, everything else went quiet. The water, the wind, even his own heartbeat. In those dark eyes, there was no animal hunger, only awareness, something like recognition. Then the bear moved. It lunged, not at the woman, but into the river. The water exploded around it, brown and white and roaring. Eleanor screamed once, not from terror, but from awe. The bear's massive shoulder hit the current sideways, splitting it just long enough to break the pull that held her. The river hesitated, confused by this new force. Cal saw his chance. He threw the rope, the orange coil arching through the air, catching light before it hit the water. "Grab it," he yelled. It slapped her arm. She caught it, the line wrapping around her wrist. The bear growled, low, resonant, not at him, but the flood itself, as if angry that the river dared challenge its strength. For one brief heartbeat, man, beast, and river were bound together. Three forces holding the same fragile thread of life. Then the river surged again. Cal felt the rope go taut. Eleanor slipped beneath the surface. The bear roared, stepping deeper. And Cal did the only thing left to do. He dove. The river didn't swallow him. It claimed him. Cold seized every nerve as if the flood had hands. Cal went under, the world replaced by brown, writhing chaos. He couldn't see the woman. He couldn't see the sky. Only bubbles, branches, and his own heartbeat pounding louder than the current. He kicked once, twice. His boot hit something solid, maybe rock, maybe the river's own rib. He pushed upward and broke the surface, coughing water and shouting her name. "Eleanor." No answer. Only the roaring of a creature not meant to speak. Then he saw it. The bear, half submerged, its fur plastered flat, eyes locked on a point downstream. It moved with terrifying grace, shoulders rolling like thunderclouds. The current slammed against its body, but the bear refused to yield. It wasn't swimming, it was advancing. And then he saw her. A flash of gray hair, a hand clutching the violin case, vanishing beneath a wave. He lunged forward, the rope biting into his chest harness, yanking him back like a leash. The signpost above groaned. He gritted his teeth and cut the tether with his knife. Freedom hurt. It meant the river owned him now. He swam toward the shape, arms burning, lungs tearing. Every breath was a negotiation. When he reached her, she wasn't moving. Her eyes were half closed, the violin case still pinned against her. "Let it go," he gasped, seizing her shoulders. She shook her head weakly. "No, it's the last thing left of him." Her husband. Cal didn't need her to explain. He could feel the weight of her years in that one sentence. The current spun them both sideways. He hooked an arm under her chest, dragging her against him. "Then we both hold it," he said, voice shredded. The bear was closer now, maybe 10 feet away, its head barely above the surface. Every breath from its nostrils came out as steam. It didn't look at them. It looked past them, scanning the water like a sentry. A roar tore from its throat, deep enough to shake the water itself. Cal turned just in time to see a log spinning toward them, big as a telephone pole. The bear moved before thought, slamming its paw against the current, angling its body. The log smashed against its shoulder and bounced away, breaking in half. The sound was like a tree snapping. The bear staggered, then planted its claws into the mud below, using its body to block the flow around them. Cal felt the change instantly. The pull of the current softened. "Now," he shouted. He dragged Eleanor toward the faint line of grass where the bank rose above the water. The bear leaned, grunting with effort, every muscle under its hide visible. For a second, it looked like the animal was lifting the entire river on its back. Eleanor coughed, sputtered, blinked. Is it saving us? Cal couldn't answer. He didn't have the breath. He only knew the river's fury had finally found something it respected. A low vibration hummed through the flood, a rumble that wasn't thunder. Upstream, a section of the embankment gave way. A wall of debris, mud, branches, and metal rushed toward them. Cal wrapped both arms around Eleanor, braced for the impact. The bear turned, snarled, and pushed forward into the surge. The collision was a blur of noise and light. Water hammered them into the bank. For an instant, Cal felt the world go silent, as if sound itself had drowned. He opened his eyes underwater. Eleanor floated above him, hair fanning like seaweed, her face calm now, almost peaceful. He kicked upward, caught her by the collar, and broke the surface again. The bear surfaced too, chest heaving, sides shuddering with exhaustion. Its paw struck a broken fence post, anchoring itself. Cal dragged Eleanor onto a narrow shelf of land barely wider than a table. The earth under him felt temporary, trembling with the river's pulse. Eleanor coughed up water, gasping alive. The bear pulled itself halfway from the current, collapsing on its front legs, its breath coming in great steaming bursts. For a long moment, none of them moved. Not the river, not the woman, not the ranger. Only the bear's chest rose and fell like a slow drumbeat. Cal's throat tightened. He had seen courage before, but never something like this. He looked at the bear, and it looked back. Between them was not gratitude or fear, just an understanding that defied language. Eleanor stirred beside him, hand trembling as she touched the violin case. The latch had broken. The instrument inside was cracked but still whole. She turned her head toward the animal. "Thank you," she whispered, voice no louder than wind. The bear exhaled, a low sigh that misted in the cold air. Then it pushed itself upright, massive and deliberate, turned toward the trees beyond the flooded meadow, and began to walk. Each step was slow, certain, leaving deep prints in the mud that the river couldn't erase. Cal watched it disappear into the fog. He wanted to call out, but no words seemed worthy. Only silence fit what had happened. The sky, torn and gray, began to brighten. And for the first time since the flood began, the river sounded different. Not angry, not alive, but listening. By the time rescue trucks reached the valley, the storm had already forgotten its anger. The sky hung low and pale, the color of a bruise fading. Steam rose from the earth, as if the ground itself was exhaling relief. But the river, swollen and muddy, still carried the sound of what it had done. Cal sat on the bank, his hands numb, his clothes stiff with mud. Eleanor Vale sat beside him, wrapped in a silver rescue blanket that made her look more spirit than woman. Her hair, once white, was streaked with brown from the river's fingers. In her lap lay the cracked violin case. A medic knelt in front of her, checking her pulse, shining a light into her eyes. She blinked but didn't flinch. Her attention was somewhere else, fixed on the tree line where the bear had vanished. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" the medic asked gently. "Yes," she whispered, "but I'm listening to something older." The medic frowned, thinking she was delirious. Cal only nodded, understanding. Reporters would later say the rescue had been a miracle, that a ranger had risked his life to save an elderly woman in a record-breaking flood. But they would skip the part where a bear stood in the same current, sharing that impossible struggle. Some stories, Cal thought, are too alive to survive being told. Eleanor shivered. Cal handed her his jacket, and she accepted it with a weak smile. "Do you believe in signs?" she asked. "I believe in rivers," he said, "and they remember everything." She chuckled softly, a dry sound that still carried music. "My husband used to say that. He said rivers don't forgive, but they sometimes give back what they take." Her eyes dropped to the violin case. Maybe that's what today was. A paramedic called for Cal. He stood, answering questions he'd barely heard, about currents, distances, debris. He spoke in numbers, not feelings. Behind him, Eleanor watched the river's surface settle into a mirror. She touched the broken latch, then her fingertips brushed the wooden side, tracing its splintered curves. When she closed the case, she didn't cry. She only looked toward the forest and whispered, "You held your promise." Hours passed. The noise of the rescue faded into the hum of generators and the rustle of wet tarps. Eleanor refused to go to the hospital. "I've had enough of white walls," she said. So Cal drove her back to his ranger cabin, a small structure tucked against the hillside, half safe from the flood. Inside, the air smelled of pine, wet wool, and smoke. He made her tea on the gas stove. She sat by the window, watching the mist crawl back into the forest. For a long time, neither spoke. The only sound was the soft rattle of the cup in her hands. Finally, she said, "When I went under, I thought I heard music." He looked at her. Music, yes, not like any I'd played. It sounded old, like something the river was humming to itself. And when I opened my eyes, the bear was there. Her voice trembled, not with fear but reverence. It didn't feel like a threat. It felt like recognition, like it knew I'd forgotten something I was supposed to remember. Cal nodded slowly. "I think it remembered too," he said. She turned to him, surprised. "You think it knew what it was doing?" He smiled faintly. "Maybe not the way we do, but it chose to stand between us and the river. That has to mean something." She didn't answer. Her eyes drifted to the violin case. The silver blanket around her shoulders caught the light, and for a second, she looked like she was glowing. Outside, the wind changed direction. A faint sound echoed through the valley. Not a growl, not a call. Something deeper. The kind of sound that could only belong to one creature. The bear. Cal set his cup down slowly. Eleanor rose, moving stiffly to the porch. The air was cool and damp. Across the meadow, fog clung to the trees. And there, framed between the pines, stood the bear. Its fur was slick bronze in the dying light. Steam rose from its body. It was watching them, not with curiosity, but with acknowledgement. Eleanor stepped forward, stopping at the porch rail. Her hand trembled on the wood. "It came back," she breathed. Cal stood beside her. The bear took a slow step toward the clearing. It wasn't threatening. Its movements were deliberate, heavy, almost ceremonial. Then, as if remembering something, it lowered its head and nudged something along the ground. A small shape slid through the grass, glinting faintly before stopping near the porch steps. Eleanor's breath caught. Cal bent down and picked it up. It was a piece of carved wood, the violin's broken bridge. The river must have torn it loose hours ago, but somehow, impossibly, the bear had found it. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes shone with tears. "It brought it back," she whispered. Cal handed it to her. The tiny object was splintered but whole enough to hold strings again. She held it against her chest like a relic. "I told you," she murmured. "The river gives back what it takes." The bear stood still for another long moment, watching her. Then it exhaled, a warm cloud that caught the last gold of the sunset. It turned toward the trees, lumbering back into the forest with the slow, deliberate grace of something ancient. Eleanor watched it vanish until the last shadow dissolved into the mist. Only then did she speak again, her voice a whisper. "It didn't just save me. It remembered me." Cal didn't answer. He looked at her, at the small fragment of wood glowing in her hands, and understood something wordless. That what they'd witnessed wasn't a rescue. It was recognition. The wild had not intervened. It had simply reminded them they still belonged to the same world. That night, neither of them slept. The storm was gone, but the valley still murmured. And somewhere beyond the trees, the sound of slow, steady breathing. A creature at rest, rolled through the dark like a lullaby. Morning arrived like an apology. The air was pale and still, the world washed clean of anger. The flood had retreated, leaving behind its fingerprints, mud-streaked walls, fallen fences, the smell of wet earth clinging to everything. But to Cal and Eleanor, the valley no longer looked ruined. It looked alive. Eleanor stood by the porch, the broken violin bridge resting in her palm. She had repaired her instrument through the night, its wood scarred but sound again. When she tightened the final string, the bow trembled in her hands, not from weakness but reverence. "Do you think it's still out there?" she asked quietly. Cal glanced toward the forest. "I don't think it ever left." She nodded, understanding something beyond the words. And she stepped outside into the morning light, set the violin beneath her chin, and began to play. The first note was thin, trembling, uncertain, but the second carried. It rose above the valley, threading through the fog, through the scent of pine and smoke. Her music wasn't perfect. It cracked, bent, wavered, but it breathed. Each sound seemed to belong as much to the air as to her. Cal stood at the doorway, motionless, listening. The forest listened too. A shape moved far across the meadow, a shadow between trees. The bear. It stopped at the ridge, facing them. The wind lifted Eleanor's hair, the sunlight caught her bow, and for one infinite heartbeat, the music and the wild existed on the same note. She finished the melody with a slow, deliberate stroke, the sound fading into silence that felt heavier than noise. The bear lowered its head, then turned away, disappearing among the trees. Eleanor lowered her violin and smiled faintly. "He remembered," she said. Cal nodded. "Or maybe it's us who finally did." The river moved quietly now, a soft murmur over stone. The morning light spread across the valley, touching every scar, every broken branch, and making them glimmer like something sacred. And as the last echo of the violin faded into the forest, the world felt balanced again, as if for one small moment. Human and wild had breathed the same breath, and remembered they were never meant to be apart.